In 2013, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey on global views of morality. What was found was that the countries often described as secular or irreligious were consistently more morally deficient in category after category when compared to their non-secular counterparts. As is apparent, the statistical results of the Pew survey seem to reinforce the stereotype that atheists are immoral. But the question remains, what explains the data? What caused the more non-secular cultures to have better moral views? And why are so many secular cultures unable to be good without God? To answer these questions, we must first look at what is needed to ground objective morality, and in turn how that relates to a religious or spiritual view of the world. It is often argued by atheists or secularists that the fact that values are subjective undermines objective morality. Morality then becomes merely an opinion, and opinions may differ.
The fact is that morality is not objective. It has no existence outside of minds, outside of personal perspectives.
Good is a point of view, Anakin.
Given then that value is subjective, to ground objective morality we need to find a value set that is universally intersubjective. To do this is simple enough if we first examine the nature of consciousness with respect to the rest of reality. As I have pointed out in other videos, we can doubt the external material world, but not our own mind. Thus our mind cannot be a material substance, and yet the interaction problem rules out substance dualism. Thus only mental substance can exist, and idealism is necessarily true. This is of course corroborated by finds in modern physics such as quantum non-realism, and the discovery that the weirdnesses of modern physics resemble information processing effects in virtual realities. Therefore everything, including our minds and our values, are contained within God's mind. Since we have concepts of value, and our minds are generated by God's mind, it follows that all senses of value derive from God's sense of value as well. Thus it follows that God's sense of value is universally intersubjective. This follows not out of some divine command theory, but rather out of logical necessity. Our concepts of goodness could not exist were it not for God's sense of goodness. Thus no sense of goodness could be logically consistent were it not ultimately aligned with God's sense of goodness, as it would ultimately contradict the reality in which it exists. Therefore, alignment with God's sense of goodness, and thus with God's will, would be objectively good, and misalignment with it would be objectively bad. In turn, this brings us to our first parallel between idealist philosophy and theology. Within religious terminology, this concept of being aligned with God's will is commonly referred to by such terms as purity or holiness. For instance, the epistles describe God's will for man as to be holy. For this is God's will, that you become holy. 1 Thessalonians 4:3. Conversely, the Psalms define purity as alignment with God's concept of goodness. How can a young man keep his way pure? By keeping your word. Psalm 119:9. Of course, this concept is by no means unique to an idealist philosophy. However, as we will see shortly, a unique clue emerges that does have a special bearing on idealist philosophy. If we naively assume reality to be external and mind-independent, then it would seem that morality would boil down to a set of external actions complying with a set of external rules. After all, this is how we commonly conceive of our actions. A child is seen as good if he obeys a set of rules given by his parents. An employee is seen as good if she adheres to the policies set by the company. And so one would naively expect that alignment with God would reduce to mere compliance with externally given rules. However, this is not the case. To see why this is not the case, we need to examine how the individual mind relates to both God and the rest of reality. When we do this, it becomes apparent that both are not merely simple objects in some external world. Firstly, we find that what we call physical spacetime is emergent from entangled quantum information. In turn, from Tononi's integrated information theory, we know that entangled information is necessarily integrated, and thus comprises a conscious state. Thus it follows that physical spacetime emerges from a conscious state at a deeper layer of reality. This deeper layer of reality is what is termed the Pleroma in Neoplatonist philosophy. Interestingly, this concept also shows up in a religious context. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. Colossians 1:19. The Greek for the term fullness here also happens to be Pleroma, and this is further fleshed out in the context just 2 verses earlier. In him all things hold together. Colossians 1:17. Here, the physical creation is held together within the larger reality of the interior of God's mind, the Pleroma of verse 19. The question then becomes how we as human souls relate to God and the world in this picture. In my video, Through a Mirror Darkly, I point out that according to the emerging field of quantum cognition, the thoughts, desires, and emotions of our inner space can be modeled mathematically as behaving exactly like wave functions in an abstract Hilbert space. Furthermore, quantum effects such as gamma synchrony in the brain corroborate this through experiment. Yet spacetime emerges from quantum information in the wave function. Thus we can think of the Pleroma as both the domain of the wave functions behind spacetime, but also the realm of our inner state. Thus the Pleroma can be seen as a shared inner space hosted by a universal mind. Without emerges from within. All of this can be corroborated through introspection. As pointed out before, the mind is immaterial, and yet dualism is incoherent. Thus idealism is true, and the universe is necessarily a mental construct generated by God's thoughts. But naturally, what generates the world must also come prior to it. However, you already know this. Ideas, such as the forms your mind interacts with, like the number 2, or the idea of the color red, are not located in space and time. This being the case, aligning with God cannot be the same as simply externally complying with a set of rules imposed from the outside. Rather, since one interacts with God in this shared inner space, alignment with God involves one's inner state. Curiously, once this is recognized, a whole host of parallels begin to emerge in theology. In religion, the concept of holiness or purity is seen as relating to one's inner spiritual condition, rather than external actions. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You, blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Matthew 23:25-26. One's outward actions are then seen as the result of one's inner state. Once again, without emerges from within. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. And again, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. Luke 6:45. Once this is realized, the flaw with a solely consequentialist view of ethics becomes apparent. As was pointed out before, alignment with God's sense of goodness is good from a universally intersubjective and thus objective point of view. However, alignment with God occurs in one's inner condition rather than with one's exterior actions and their consequences. Thus, God's conception of goodness has more to do with one's inner condition than external factors. For a man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. In turn, this explains why lust and hatred are seen as bad as adultery and murder, respectively. The inner condition associated with the external actions is the same. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:27-28. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. 1 John 3:15. Expanding on this concept, early Christianity developed this principle into the 7 deadly sins: luxuria or lust, gula or gluttony, avaritia or avarice, acedia or sloth, ira or wrath, invidia or envy, and superbia or pride. Rather than being a set of actions with consequences, each sin is an inner attitude or orientation of the heart. But what are the origins of these vices? If God's values are objectively good, then any intentionalities to create based on those values must also be objectively good. As such, all of creation must be good as well. Thus, the only way for a creation to be evil is through it being deprived of what is needed to make it good. This concept of evil as the absence of good is what is known as privatio boni. However, parts cannot simply vanish from existence and go missing from the whole. Thus, the privation must be one of a separation or break in the design of a good creation. Take a glass, for instance. By itself, it is good, but if it shatters on the floor, the glass shards it forms could cut a person's feet. Likewise, an inner vice could be analogized to a shattering or distortion in the ordering or syntax of one's inner conscious state. Thus, each vice would have its undistorted counterpart or virtue. This is seen in the 7 cardinal virtues. The counterpart of lust, for instance, would be chastity. Undistorted gluttony would be temperance. Greed, charity. Sloth, diligence. Wrath, patience. Envy, kindness. And pride, humility. To demonstrate, wrath would be a deficit of patience. Once this deficit is reordered so as to be completed, it would become patience. Once all of this is understood, the cause of the deficiencies seen in atheistic morality becomes apparent. A faulty materialistic metaphysics where the visible physical world is seen as mind-independent and thus existing independent of God's mind leads to a faulty view of meta-ethics and ethics. The secular approach to ethics factors out the universal intersubjectivity needed for objective morality, by factoring out the existence of the mind needed to have that frame of reference. The consequence is a view of ethics which is concerned only with the consequences in the external visible world, and not with one's inner state. However, once one remembers that the manifest physical world is necessarily being generated by an unmanifest mind, one's view of reality shifts, and one's connection to that mind through one's inner condition begins to factor in. As a consequence, the source of the flaw in secular approaches to ethics becomes apparent, as the framework in which they were invented is shown to be obsolete. Thus, by attacking a material view of the world, the undesirable rise of moral nihilism and crass hedonism can be countered, and eventually reversed to the more sensible views of morality once held. If you like this video, subscribe and support me on Patreon, and don't forget to check out my novel, Alaris, The Lances of Light, on Amazon Kindle in the description below. You can find us on Facebook as well at Idealism and Science versus Atheism.